played out in the life of Elijah in a tremendous way. Let me just rush through the background of Elijah. Elijah's a prophet. He was alive during the period of the kings of Israel. It's a time of the divided kingdom, where there was a northern part of the kingdom, 10 tribes, and a southern part, 2 tribes. And he happened to be a prophet for God during the time of King Ahab. Ahab was a very bad king. He was a very bad king because he married a horrible, despicable, wicked woman. Her name was Jezebel. And Jezebel, among other things, the worst thing she did was she introduced to King Ahab Baal worship. And of course, King Ahab then introduced to the nation of Israel Baal worship. Baal worship is a horrible, demonic worship of false gods. It is horrible before God, not only because it's not worshiping the true God, not only because it's demonic rather than godly, but because it calls for the sacrifice of children. It is a horrible thing before God, and God hated it. God absolutely detested Baal worship, and the people were never supposed to go down this path, and yet they did. And so he calls on the prophet Elijah to deal with it. And the first way he deals with it, and he goes to the king Ahab and says, you've introduced wickedness to the land. Because of your wickedness, let there be no more rain. And then for 3.5 years, not a drop. Talk about some ticked off farmers. No rain, 3.5 years. During this time, the land all begins to shrivel and die, and the water all begins to disappear. The creek beds go dry. Nothing good is going on in the land. Boy, the sky is pretty. And just kind of the way it played out. During this time, Elijah needed to flee. One, because he was despised by the rulers, the ruling elite of the land, King Ahab, and of course his wonderful wife Jezebel. And so he's running and hiding. And while he's running and hiding, the ravens are feeding him. And gets to the point where it's so bad where he has to go find shelter in a different place. And he goes and he runs across this widow lady who has a son. And he says, can I stay with you? Can you make me a meal? I'm really hungry. And she says, well, you can join us in our last meal, because I have only enough oil and flour for one last cake, and then we're just going to die. Sounds fun, doesn't it? He says, I tell you what, ma'am. If you are willing to invite me to join you, if you make dinner for me, there will be enough for you. She says, well, yeah, there will be enough. We'll share, but then we're all going to just die because I got no more. He says, no, you don't understand. You're willing to feed me, there will always be enough. And so she used up all the oil and all the flour and made her meal and gave it to Elijah, and she and her son ate, and that was the last meal. Except the next morning, there was more oil in the jar and more flour in the pantry. Well, this is the last meal, and she'd make it, and he'd eat it, and the next day, there was more. And this miracle just continued and continued and continued. The hand of God was upon this man in incredible ways. He was able to see this miraculous event play out every single day after day after day, till one day this woman's son dies. Oh, my goodness. Elijah goes and brings this boy back to life. Then she says, wow, you really must be from God. The daily miracle wasn't enough, I guess. But eventually she sees God's hand in the raising of her son from the dead. And an amazing thing. After about 3.5 years of no rain, Elijah goes back and presents himself to King Ahab and says, I tell you what, it's time. The land needs to decide. The people of Israel need to decide. Are we going to follow after God of our history, or are we going to follow after the God of Baal that you have introduced? People need to decide, so let's call it out. And so they build 2 altars. And Elijah by himself sets up an altar, and he is going to sacrifice an animal and invite God, Yahweh, the Lord our God, to have the offering. And the priests and the prophets of Baal are going to build an altar, sacrifice an animal, invite the Baals to come and receive the offering. It's a pretty cool thing. And Elijah says, you guys go first. And so they start calling on the Baals, come and take your sacrifice. And they start going around in circles and dancing and doing their little jigs. And nothing's happening. And after hours of this, Elijah says, well, maybe your gods are hard of hearing. Or maybe they're asleep. Maybe you should yell louder. And they do it. And they get louder and louder and louder. They're weeping and wailing and calling on their gods, and nothing's happening. And so they start cutting themselves to bleed themselves, because this is part of the way they call on their gods. Nothing happens. Why? Oh, because God is preventing false gods from doing anything. And after giving up finally, Elijah says, I guess it's my turn. And before I start, why don't we soak down the whole thing? Let's just pour water on it. Just bucket after bucket after bucket of water. By the way, the most precious commodity in the land was water. And he's spilling it all over the place. But he's saturating the wood. He's soaking down the animal that's been sacrificed. Everything is a muddy, watery mess. And he steps aside and says, God, I'm praying out loud, not because you need me to or because I need to, but because these folks need to hear. They need to know that you are God, and only you are God. Please, accept this sacrifice. Poof, poof, fire from heaven comes, licks up the water, licks up everything. The stones are burnt to crisp. I mean, everything is undone. God has been seeing this. God, now, he says then to the people, all right, your decision, which God you want to follow. Now, I know which God I'm going to choose after that display. How about you? And so everybody chooses to be on God's side, not the Baal side. And Elijah says, well, if that's the case, you've got to eliminate the priests and the prophets and destroy their temples and destroy their places and destroy their totem poles or whatever those thingies are. And get rid of it all. And they did. That's, by the way, that's the kind way of saying destroying everything, including them. And they were slaughtered in that day. Man, the hand of God had moved. And so then and Elijah says to Ahab, you know what? Maybe you better eat something and drink something. Work on your energy, because I believe the rain is about to fall. And then he goes on the mountain and he gets down, hunkers down real good and tight and starts to pray. God, let it rain. God, let it rain. God, let it rain. And he says, go check. Look out over the sky. See if you see a cloud. The guy looks and, well, no, it's just another beautiful day. And no, there's nothing there, Elijah. Just a minute. He prays more and he's really into it. Go check again. Yeah, no, another beautiful blue sky, Elijah. Nothing coming. Please, God, make it rain. Sends the guy to look one more time. I said, well, I see something kind of like the shape of a hand, the size of a hand, way off in the distance. Ah, good. And he goes and says to Ahab, you better start mounting your chariot, because it's going to rain. You're going to want to get rolling. And about that time, the clouds start growing in volume and in intensity. Everything is getting dark. You can hear the thunder in the distance. Things are beginning to roar. And then the best part of the story is Elijah then kind of looks around, takes his robe, tucks it into his belt, and then runs. And he runs so hard and he runs so fast that he outruns the horses and the chariots of the king's people. Unbelievable. And he runs hard and he runs fast for a couple of reasons. One, he doesn't want to get caught in the deluge. But number two, because when Queen Jezebel heard what Elijah had done through the power of God, and the people had rejected her false religion and chosen God, she says, well, what you did to my priests and prophets, I'm going to do to you. And so he's actually also running for his life. He was very much afraid. Now, first of all, if he just 3.5 years ago said, God, don't let it rain, and it did. And then he said, God, rain fire from heaven and take your sacrifice, and it did. And then he said, God, let it rain, and it did. I'm not so sure I'd be afraid of one lady. But he was. But he was. And he got to his end, he curled up in a little ball, and he wanted to die. That's where we're going to pick up real soon. The Lord says, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. What's going on? Elijah is completely unhinged. He's at the end of his rope. He doesn't want to go on. He needs simply to be done. He needs a new touch from God. He needs to experience God in a fresh new way. Something that he's not seen or heard or done or tasted or smelled before. He's been a servant of God. He has heard the voice of God. He has obeyed the voice of God before, but he needed something new, something fresh, something different. The Lord is about to pass by.